When I took over Secretary of State, I'll refer you back to the hearings we had in the Senate in January about the role I hope to play. And I believe very strongly this president was elected. One of the reasons why he was elected, very specific things, but one of the reasons why President Trump was elected is sort of an understanding among the American people that our foreign policy was in need of a complete recalibration. A recalibration because the world had dramatically changed. Many of the institutions, policies, assumptions that our foreign policy was operating under were built upon a world that no longer existed. And it required us to re-examine that. One of the assumptions that I think we had lost during this period of time, and I don't mean to make this an academic lecture, but I wanted to give you some insight into the broader thinking, as I highlighted at that hearing less than a year, almost a year ago now, is one of the assumptions was the loss of the notion of the national interest in our foreign policy. At the core of foreign policy needs to be the national interest of the United States. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't issues and things we care about in the world, but at its core, the core principle of the national interest, the core principle behind our foreign policy needs to be our national interest. So you have to, first of all, define what is the national interest, and then you have to apply it. We defined it as we are in favor of foreign policies that make America safer or stronger or more prosperous, hopefully all three, but at least one of those three. And then it requires you to prioritize. Even the richest, most powerful and influential country on earth has limited resources, has limited time. And it has to be able to dedicate those resources and time through a process of prioritization. That includes geographic prioritization. It also includes issue prioritization. And that's what we intend to do here. Then you have to have the mechanisms of foreign policy to deliver on it. In essence, you have to have a Department of State and a National Security Council and all the elements of U.S. foreign policy influence and power to deliver, to identify and then deliver on those priorities. And that's what we've attempted to do here, and I think we're well on our way to doing it. There's more work to be done. There's things we will improve upon. But generally speaking, it was the genesis behind the reorganization of the department, oftentimes applying reforms that secretaries of states of both parties, appointed by presidents of both parties, have long sought to do. And we're very proud of that going into effect and continuing to work forward. I think we generally avoided, massive disruptions to our operation, although any transition involves some disruption. But we're very happy with the way we empowered our regional bureaus, meaning our embassies and the folks at the desks here behind the regions have become more empowered and having influence over every element of our foreign policy, particularly how it's applied tactically. At the same time, one of the things we looked at is foreign aid. Foreign aid is not a separate activity of the United States government. It is an element and a tool of our foreign policy, and it should be used for the purpose of furthering the national interest. That doesn't mean we don't care about human rights. That doesn't mean we don't care about starvation. That doesn't mean we don't care about hunger. That doesn't mean we don't care about humanitarian need. What it does mean, however, is that even foreign aid, which is not charity, it is an act of the U.S. taxpayer. Now, American charities are free to give their money to whoever they want, as long as it's not a sanctioned entity. But the United States and the taxpayer money should be spent in furtherance of our foreign policy, should be spent in places and on things that further our foreign policy. And even that is not unlimited. We have a limited amount of money that we can dedicate to foreign aid and humanitarian assistance, and that has to be applied in a way that furthers our national interests. And that's what we have sought to do as well.
I'd like to ask how you view recent escalation of tensions between Japan and China. You've been known for your tough rhetoric towards China over the years. Do you condemn China's recent provocative actions against Japan?
I think I've been nice to China, in terms of the work we have to do with them. And I had another job. My job now is I represent the President of the United States and the United States in foreign diplomacy. And I think we've made good progress with the Chinese. The Japanese are a very close ally of the United States. I think these tensions are pre-existing. We understand that's one of the dynamics that has to be balanced in that region. And I believe that we feel very strongly that we can continue with our strong, firm partnership and alliance with Japan and do so in a way that continues to allow us to find productive ways to work together with the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government. Look, there'll be tensions, there's no doubt about it. At the end of the day, China is and it will continue to be a rich and powerful country and a factor in geopolitics. We have to have relations with them. We have to deal with them. We have to find the things we are able to work together on. And I think both sides are mature enough to recognize that there will be points of tension now and for the foreseeable future. Our job as part of responsible statecraft is to find opportunities to work together, because I think if there's a global challenge that China and the U.S. can work together on, I think we can solve it. And there'll be points of tension. We well recognize that, and our job is to balance these two things. I think both sides understand that. And I think we can do that without imperiling or in any way undermining our very firm commitment to our partners in the Indo-Pacific. That includes not just Japan, but South Korea, and obviously if you extend further out, I don't want to leave anybody out, but India and Australia and New Zealand and all the other countries. And we also have growing and burgeoning relationships with countries like Vietnam and even Cambodia that we really haven't had, very close contacts with historically. But we've talked to them a lot lately, obviously through the context of the conflict going on with Thailand, but also to figure out opportunities to work together strategically. And I say Thailand, of course, we've had a very long and strong strategic alliance with them for many years.
Several faith-based organizations have been calling on the administration to reopen the U.S. refugee admissions program, particularly for religious minorities facing persecution. That includes Afghanistan, Syria, Iran. Is it going to be a goal in 2026 to expand that program again beyond South Afrikaners?
In the last 4 years, we had a flood of people enter this country through a variety of means. So that's what we confronted. We have to stop that. And we did. We've been successful. You see the border secured, the number of illegal entries has completely collapsed. And now we're facing a second challenge, and that is we've admitted a lot of people into the United States. And perhaps the overwhelming majority of them are not bad people and so forth. This is all true. But there are people, we know, for a fact, that there are people in this country who got in through some form of vetting that was wholly insufficient. And we've seen tragic evidence of that very recently, including people that we claim to have vetted. So, why does that happen? Because there are some places where you can't vet people. You can only vet people on the basis of information you have about them. But that information is oftentimes dependent on whether there's some local authority that actually has any information about them. So that is the challenge we're facing, which is why the president has sort of put a stop to all of these things until these systems for admitting people into our country can be improved. But I think everyone would understand that after a flood of 15 to 20 million people into our country, almost unrestrained in some extent, over the last 4 years before taking over in January of this year, there's a desire in our country to put a stop to that until we can fix these processes to ensure that not only do we know who's in the country now, but in the future, we're not going to face some of these challenges that we faced in the past. So, look, the United States remains the most generous country in the world when it comes to legal immigration. This year alone, close to 1 million people will enter this country legally and have their green card and go to war. But we do have a right, like every sovereign country does, to know who you are, why you're coming, what you've done in the past, and what we think you might or might not do in the future. We have a right. We have a right to make sure that you're not going to come to this country and pose a burden on our social safety network. All of these things are rights of sovereign countries. A bunch of sovereign countries in the world do it. Most of the countries in the world have far more restrictive immigration policies than the United States has ever had. But we are in a special period right now. This is not like business as usual. This is, right now, we are less than a year removed from the most reckless migratory incompetence in American history, where a flood of people and mass migration events entered the United States. And they can claim all they want that they vetted people. This is just not true. Some of them were cursory vetting, and in some cases you couldn't vet them because the countries or places they came from had no documents upon which they could be vetted on.
White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles said that the U.S. would need congressional approval to conduct ground strikes in Venezuela. Do you share that view? And on your response today on regime change, Wiles already acknowledged that the point of the boat strikes was to pressure Maduro, i.e. have him leave. Why not just acknowledge that this is a regime?
It is clear that the current status quo with the Venezuelan regime is intolerable for the United States. The status quo, that they operate and cooperate with terrorist organizations against the national interests of the United States. Not just cooperate, but partner with and participate in activities that threaten the national interests of the United States. So yes, our goal is to change that dynamic. And that's why the president's doing what he's doing. Change that dynamic by ensuring that no one wants to get on drug boats anymore. People were just going out there, openly without any fear of the Reaper. And now I think people understand, it's not a good idea. By the way, we haven't had a strike in the Caribbean basin in almost 5 weeks. Do you know why? It's not because we stopped looking. It's because no one wants to get on a boat anymore and do that. So it's been effective at cutting that down. Now there's been strikes in the Pacific. So the bottom line is that, sure, our goal is to, what's the point of doing something? But the change, people want to focus on regime this and this and that. The goal here is very simple. The national interest of the United States. The President of the United States was elected to protect the American people, to protect America. That's what he was elected to do. It's one of his fundamental promises that Donald J. Trump made when he was elected President of the United States is, I am going to protect this country. Protect us from what? From the threat of terrorism, from threats to our economy, and from threats these drug organizations and these terrorist organizations pose against the United States. And if you are an ally, a friend, a partner, or cooperate or participate in activities that threaten the United States, you're going to have a problem with President Trump. I think the only shocking thing here is that a lot of people say that. People run all the time for office. I'm going to take on the cartels. I'm going to do this. He's actually doing it. He's not doing anything he didn't say he was not going to do during this campaign. He said he was going to go after the cartels. And now he's going after the cartels, and everybody's shocked. Don't be shocked. This is a man who was elected president because he says and then he does. He doesn't just say and then forget about it.
In congressional approval on land strikes, do you think that the United States does need to go to Congress in order to conduct land strikes in Venezuela?
Well, look, I'm not going to speculate about things that haven't happened and may never happen. I'm not going to speculate on that. All I'm going to tell you is that two things. And I remind Congress all the time. By the way, I was very consistent on this position because it was my position when I was in the Senate. Number one, no administration, Republican or Democrat, has ever accepted the War Powers Act as being constitutional. That said, multiple administrations, including this one, have sought congressional approval and or certainly congressional notification of actions taken. Why? Because American action is always strongest when it has the buy-in and the participation of a broad set of actors. Now, given our current political climate, that's not always easy because we do have people today in politics that are against everything that President Trump is for. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter if they themselves had the same position. If it's President Trump's idea, they're against it reflexively. Okay? That's the nature of the current climate in our politics. But I can tell you that to this point, nothing has happened that requires us to notify Congress or get congressional approval or cross the threshold into war. We have very strong legal opinions. We have now briefed Capitol Hill 23 times, 23 briefings, bipartisan briefings on Capitol Hill. I have personally participated in 6 of those 23 at the highest levels of the committee, but then the full House and then the full Senate, which, by the way, are always interesting. Okay, get it. I've been there before. Okay, so I was part of this thing in the past as well. But you do this briefing, you answer all their questions, and then they go out and tell people, we heard nothing, we saw nothing, that we were pleased with. They already had their answer before they went in, but we do them anyways. And we continue to do them. Not to mention the individual calls I've had with leaders in Congress, and I'm not going to disclose what those are. So everybody over there knows what we're doing, they know why we're doing it, and we've kept Congress fully apprised, and we'll continue to do so.
The settlers' violence is rampant in the West Bank.
The what is, I'm sorry?
The settlers,
yes,
the Israeli
okay,
settlers' violence in the West Bank is being escalating, is increasing. Also, Israel is building around 20 settlements unit. Doesn't this undermine your own effort in the peace process? And also, if I may, on Gaza, the humanitarian situation is dire. The babies have been frozen to death because of the weather. Tents have been flooded. Is there anything that the United States can do to alleviate the suffering of the civilians in Gaza?
Yeah. In the case of the West Bank, we have, and you've seen our embassy even has put out statements and comments about specific incidents there that we're concerned about, that we do think, create a point of strong friction in the broader effort. And our own embassy, and Ambassador Huckabee has spoken to this as recently as a couple weeks ago, very firmly, I believe. And so we'll continue to communicate that as we have and make our opinion known in regards to its impact on the broader challenges. In the case of humanitarian, absolutely. I mean, this is the reason why that group is set up there every single day. We've been successful at opening new corridors. We want to continue to see that increase. We want to continue to see the flow of aid increase into those parts of Gaza that are still under Hamas control. But it also goes back, not to sound like a broken record, to why it is so critical to have the border peace put in place and the Palestinian technocratic group put in place. Because that allows us now, when you have this technocratic Palestinian group in place, and a stabilization force to provide security, it now allows us to have someone we can work with to turn over the humanitarian aid to and have them be the ones that help distribute it along with these international partners. That's what the point we're trying to get to, that we can get to a point where that is, and part of the thing with humanitarian aid is also security. Someone has to provide security for these convoys as they go in, because oftentimes they have been attacked, they've been looted, they've been so forth. We don't have a force that can do that right now unless the Israelis are going to go in, and that would violate the ceasefire. But if we have a stabilization force on the ground, they could provide security. And then the technical side of it, the logistical side of it, along with the international partners, is what the Palestinian Technocratic Organization can do. That is why we are in such a hurry to finalize that phase of this deal so that the aid can flow. And not just aid, then we can move from aid to reconstruction, which is the goal everybody has. You want to reach a point in which you're not providing aid because Gaza has an economy, and it's not an economy controlled by Hamas. But we can't get to that stage until we can secure the place. And that's why we're in such a hurry to finalize that phase of the deal.
He said he was willing to end the war in Ukraine based on principles he had outlined. last summer, and that included a complete Ukrainian withdrawal from 4 regions, most of which are not occupied by Russia, recognition of occupied Russian territory in Ukraine, and the complete lifting of sanctions. That goes beyond some of the recent conversations you've been having. So do you think Putin is serious about peace, and is the U.S. willing to recognize occupied Russian territory in Ukraine?
Look, I think ultimately there is what people say, and I'm not claiming that that's not his position. I'm just saying there's what people say and then what people do. In the end, we're not going to base our approach to finding peace here on the basis simply of what people are saying. We're going to base it on what people are willing to agree to, what countries are willing to agree to. Our role is very simple. We try to understand what the Russian position, how much can they give and what do they have to have. We understand the Ukrainian position, and we try to find whether those two things can overlap. Maybe that happens this week. Maybe that happens next month. Maybe that's not ready for a few months. That's not up to us. That's up to the two sides. In the end, it's up to them to make a deal. We can't force Ukraine to make a deal. We can't force Russia to make a deal. They have to want to make a deal. The role we're trying to play is a role of figuring out whether there's any overlap here that they can agree to. And that's what we've invested a lot of time and energy and continue to do so. That may not be possible. I hope it is. I hope it can get done this month before the end of the year. I want it to end as soon as possible. I know the president is deeply committed to helping it end. I know this, though. We're the only ones that can do it. If we were not involved, no one would be talking to both sides. The UN can't do it. But who else is going to do it? Nobody in Europe can do it. So I think I think the one thing people should have is an expression of gratitude that President Trump is willing to continue to engage in this despite the fact that we haven't yet gotten the outcome that he hopes to have, because no one else could do it. And so that's what we're trying to do here. So this whole narrative that we're trying to force something on Ukraine is silly. We can't force it. There's no peace deal that Ukraine, there is no peace deal unless Ukraine agrees to it. But there's also no peace deal unless Russia agrees to it. We are just trying to find whether there's common ground that we can make happen. And maybe that's not possible. Maybe it is. Maybe that's not possible right now. But we don't think our work could potentially serve as a baseline for that in the future. Maybe it is possible now. We're going to continue to test it and see where we can get to.
Is the U.S. willing to recognize occupied territory?
I'm not going to speak on any specifics of any deal because we're not going to be able to negotiate a peace deal, especially one like this, in the media. Suffice it to say, let me just put it to you this way. There can't be a peace deal unless Ukraine agrees to it. And there can't be a peace deal, of course, unless Russia agrees to it. But remember that. Any peace deal is one that Ukraine has to agree to because they're a combatant. If Ukraine says we don't agree to it, there won't be peace. So our job is not to force anything on anyone. It is to try to figure out if we can nudge both sides to a common place. And guys, in a conflict like this, in a war like this, that's not easy. It takes a lot of time. We're going to have some patience with it, unfortunately. It's already gone longer. But understand why the president cares about this. Okay? Because let's be honest here, and I'm not trying to diminish this, okay? Because it's an interesting position to be in. The United States only we don't provide weapons to Russia, we only provide weapons to Ukraine. The United States doesn't sanction Ukraine, it's only sanctioned Russia. And yet we are still the only country in the world that can talk to both sides. So let's be clear about the role we played in this so far. I mean, we're the only ones that can. But, so I don't mean to be dismissive of why this matters or it's important, because this is going on in another continent. We've got issues in our own hemisphere we need to be dealing with. That if you were to ask prioritization, I would argue that something in our hemisphere, from our national interest, is more important than something in another continent. But it doesn't make Ukraine and Russia unimportant. We care about it. That's why we're involved in it. But by the same token, why does the president care? I'll tell you why. This week, 9,000 people will die, including like 5,000 or 6,000 weekly Russian casualties, okay, in a war. This is a bloody, nasty conflict. In the same time, the entire electric grid, the entire infrastructure of Ukraine is being destroyed almost as fast as it's being rebuilt. Every week that goes by, the cost of rebuilding that country gets exponentially higher. It is now becoming generational reconstruction. This is a very damaging war that's going to have incredible implications. There are now hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, probably maybe in millions, who have not lived in Ukraine in years. They've been displaced to other countries. The implications of this long term for Ukraine are dramatic, and for Russia too, but for Ukraine, if we're focused on them. This is why the president wants to end it. He thinks it's a bloody, nasty, horrifying war, and he doesn't like wars. He really doesn't like wars. He thinks they're a waste of money, time, and talent. And he wants this one to end. And we're doing everything we can to end it. And it may or may not be possible, but we're certainly going to keep trying.
In your national security strategy, you've warned Europe about civilizational erasure. When you've been watching what's been happening in Australia with the rise of anti-Semitism and our government's response to the Bondi massacre, our prime ministers dodged direct questions on Islamic extremism, but then unprompted evoked right-wing extremism as a threat. Do you have any message to Australia about civilizational erasure, and why is America watching?
Look, I just think it's very simple, and that is that any mass migration is highly disruptive to any country. We talked about it here in the United States. When you experience mass migration, I don't talk about immigration, I'm talking about mass migration. Okay, mass migration is a negative thing. It's not positive. And it's very difficult for any society to absorb and assume hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people over a short period of time, especially if they come from halfway around the world. There are cultural and assimilations issues related to that, et cetera. And so these are concerns that it's concerns I have about our own country primarily. It's been a priority of this administration to address this. But I think it's a growing concern in Europe. I mean, there are other voices in Europe and obviously in Australia as well that have expressed concern about this. These are facts. This doesn't make you anti-anybody. What it makes is you do have, as a sovereign country, the right to control how many people you absorb, how many people you allow in, and who those people are. This is a very basic sovereign right. Okay? It doesn't mean you don't allow any people in. There are people coming into this country every day to visit, to work, to live permanently, but you have to know who they are, and you have to have some limits and controls over what those numbers are. And obviously, because of some of the things we've seen, mass migration over the last decade has been highly disruptive, not just to the United States, but also to continental Europe, and in some cases in the Indo-Pacific as well. So I just think this is a real challenge that multiple Western advanced industrialized countries are facing, and I think it's pronounced in parts of Europe as well, and obviously, at least on the basis of your question, appear to be a challenge as well in Australia.
Going back to the previous question about Europe, and I believe the Sky News reporter referenced civilizational erasure, which is a term that has been used by both the White House and the State Department. Both the White House and the State Department have made kind of recurring overtures to Europe as a civilization that is in some sort of danger and that should join with the United States as a sort of Western civilizational bloc. And it seems to be a recurring priority. However, with the release of the National Security Strategy, many European leaders, leader of Germany, members of the EU, of the European Parliament, have found it totally unacceptable or offensive or question the allyship of the United States with the rhetoric that was used. So I just wonder if the United States is correct in that these policies, like mass migration, will lead to civilizational erasure. Is it possible to save European civilization if the governments simply don't want to be saved?
How has this alliance long been described? As the Western alliance, right? What is it that, and it's not just me saying, you go to these NATO meetings, you meet with people, what they will tell you is our shared history, our shared legacy, our shared values, our shared priorities. That's what they talk about as the reason for this alliance. Well, if you erase your shared history, your shared culture, your shared ideology, your shared priorities, your shared principles, then you just have a straight up defense agreement. That's all you have. So what I'm trying to point to, and what we've tried to point to, is very simple. That is, at the bedrock and at the cornerstone of our relationship, with example with Europe, is the fact that we do have a shared culture, a shared civilization, a shared experience, and shared values and principles on things like human rights, on freedom, on liberty, on democracy, on all sorts of on the rights of the individual, on all these sorts of things that we in this nation are the inheritors of in many cases, because many of these ideas that led to the founding of our country found their genesis in some of these places in the Western Alliance. If you take that away, if that's wiped out because for whatever reason it's no longer a priority, I do think it puts a strain and threatens the alliance in the long term and in the big picture. Now, whatever internal politics causes people to dispute this, I'm not going to comment on, other than to tell you that I do think that at the core of these special relationships we have is the fact that we have shared history, shared values, shared civilizational principles that we should be unapologetic about. This is a nation that was founded on Western principles. Founded on Western principles like liberty, the value of and the right of the individual, the right of self-governance. These are all Western values. Now, others may have adopted it in different parts of the world, but they emanate from Western history. And it's something that we should be unapologetic about. Why would we be apologetic about it? Anyone who doesn't recognize, for example, that many of the features of our system of government find their root in Roman and Greek history is a fool. Is a fool. It's just not true. And so I think that we need to understand and embrace that, not negate it. And I think that's what we're pointing to here, is that we are concerned that particularly in parts of Western Europe, those things that underpin our alliance and our tie to them could be under threat in the long term. And by the way, there are leaders in those countries that recognize that as well. Some say it openly, some say it privately. In the eastern and southern part of Europe, they're much more open about it. Nonetheless, it is a factor that needs to be addressed.
Mr. Secretary, on Gaza, You've said repeatedly in this room now that this is peace is a process, that phase 2 could take next 2 to 3 years to fully
You
implement.
can't build buildings in one day. Right?
Is there a possibility in your mind that the status quo, more or less as we see it now, with this sort of insufficient flow of aid, periodic violations of the ceasefire by each side, a lack of reconstruction, and of course the absence of an international security force, that this could potentially continue more or less through the rest of the president's term? And if not, I'm not asking for a date, but I think we'd all like to know. We've heard from the president and yourself that there are all these countries that want to join the international security force. When will they deploy? Are we talking in the next year, in the next couple of years? And is there a certain amount of time that could pass at which point the administration, without an ISF, at which point the administration would green light or will green light Israel to resume its war?
The way to answer that question is this way. No one is arguing that the status quo is sustainable in the long term nor desirable. And that's why we have a sense of urgency about bringing phase 1 to its full completion, which is the establishment of the border peace and the Palestinian Technocratic Authority or organization that's going to be on the ground. And then the stabilization force comes closely thereafter. Once we've established that, we have a lot of confidence that we are going to have the donors for the reconstruction effort and for all of the humanitarian support in the long-term building in phases 2 and phases 3. We just don't think that we're going to get to phase 2 or phase 3. We don't believe that we can have a successful donor conference, just as a real example, until people know they want to know who's in charge, and they want to know that there's security. Okay? They want to make sure that who's going to pledge billions of dollars to build things that are going to get blown up again because a war starts. So they want to know who's in charge, and they want to know that there's security, and that there'll be long-term stability. So no one would argue that what we have in place now is sustainable in the long term. We have to get to the completion of phase 1. I am confident we will, within the time frame necessary to make it successful. It's just not today, but hopefully very, very soon. We've made real progress. We made progress as late as yesterday in additional names for this Palestinian organization that's going to be the technocratic organization. So I think we're very close. I think we're going to get there. I'm optimistic that we're going to be able to get through phase 1. And then what I meant about taking years for phase 2 or phase 3 is not years to start it. I'm just being, to rebuild a place, to put buildings and rebuild an economy, that takes time. You'll have the donors, but you still have to have the equipment. You got to build. You have to do all that sort of thing. This is a long-term project. Phase 1 is not a long-term project. It has to happen. I'm confident it'll happen within a time frame that makes it successful. We're very committed to it, and so is everybody else. Everybody else in the region understands that there is no plan B. If this doesn't work, plan B or what's going to happen is a new war, and no one wants that. No one wants that.
My colleagues and yourself paints a seemingly chaotic and hostile world at times. So very simply and generally put, what do you believe is the biggest threat facing the United States today?
I don't know we live in a world where we have a single threat that we can identify. I think there are multiple things that you look, both short-term and long-term. As I pointed to in the hemisphere, in our own hemisphere, closest to home geographically, it's the rise and the power of transnational criminal terrorist group who are destabilizing nation states throughout the region and pose a direct threat to the United States through overthrowing governments, destabilizing these governments, leading to mass migration, and certainly the trafficking of drugs, and also providing fertile ground for potential, outside of hemisphere actors to act within our hemisphere in the long term. That's a major threat. I think we face some challenges. And we know the United States industrial base, the United States supply chains become dangerously dependent on other countries for many of the things that are elemental and critical to not just sustaining what we have, but building the economy of the 21st century. And so building up our industrial base and diversifying our supply chains are a critical threat that the United States needs to confront. I think related to that, not directly related to the Department of State, but somewhat related to the United States, is building up our defense industrial base as well. One of the challenges that we face, and so does much of the world, certainly in the West, is the ability to build weaponry at a scale and scope necessary, not just to deal with the threats of today, but to innovate and develop those tomorrow. It simply just takes too long to build up defense articles, get them to market in a timely fashion. And not only do we complain about that, but we have allies who want to buy things from us that we just haven't been able to produce fast enough. And so the president's made that a priority to confront. I think beyond that, I think you would argue that in the big picture, long term, we have to understand that the United States has interests in every part of the world that are related to these two threats. In the case of Africa, we see countries that have extraordinary opportunity to develop economically, the youngest population in the world, and the United States wants to have relationships, both commercial and personal, with many of these nations as they emerge in their own right into an era of prosperity. We want to be there to help assist in that if possible. We want to make sure that American interests are taken into account. Unfortunately, there are many countries around the world that in the past have had to rely on predatory practices of other countries to receive stability, to receive funds necessary to build infrastructure or what have you. We want to make sure that American businesses are at the table offering alternatives, be it in telecommunication, be it in artificial intelligence and technology, be it in basic infrastructure. So there's a lot of things to uncover and unpack, and I think in the long term as well. And I think our national security strategy reflects a lot of this. So I wish we lived in a world where we had one major threat. Many of these are interrelated.
Secretary, I wanted to drill down on the way you and the administration see America's national interests, because you said that Ukraine is not on our continent, not our war. You said something in our own hemisphere is more important. So this involves both our commitment to the negotiations in Ukraine, which the president is passionately committed to, for ending the rising numbers of deaths, he says. Russian President Putin told my colleague, Kira Simmons, today at the news conference in Moscow, "We do not consider ourselves responsible for the loss of life because it was not us who started this war." Does the administration, does the president, you, the administration, believe that Putin was not the aggressor here? And if so, how can you reach an agreement between two parties when the aggressor will not acknowledge that he invaded a sovereign country? Let me, if I just may follow. So how do you reach any kind of compromise or ceasefire when Vladimir Putin repeatedly says, and you say that may not be what he really believes, but he has never said that he would make concessions publicly, and he's never said that he invaded Ukraine. He's always said that that is Russian territory. So why is that not in our national interest? When also in our hemisphere, if it's impossible to eliminate the threat of narco-terrorism as you describe it, with Maduro in charge, you've described the extent beyond narco-terrorism and drug trafficking of his threat. You've described it today as a threat to the region. Doesn't that mean there will have to be regime change? And is it in America's national interest to get involved in regime change in our hemisphere, given what's happened before? And why is Maduro this overriding, I mean, he is an overriding threat by all acknowledgement, but why is the former president of Honduras not a regional threat, who was personally involved in hundreds of tons?
I'm not involved in the pardon process, which is what that was. He's no longer in office. So that might be.
He was in a U.S. prison.
No, I understand, but I can't comment on our pardons process because that's not an area that I have many jobs, but that ain't one of them. I'm not hiding from it. I'm just telling you I don't know. I can't give you an informed answer on that because I was just involved in that process. As far as the question of Maduro and his impediment, look, I've just made the observation that it's hard to make a deal with someone. Everybody says we should go to negotiation. All I'm observing, I'm just saying all I'm observing is he's never kept any of the deals he's made in the past, which makes it difficult to consider making one in the future. Beyond that, I'm not going to speculate about what might or may not happen. Ultimately, I can tell you what our goals are and what our interests are, and that's how we've defined them. Now, in the case of Ukraine, no one has said that Ukraine is a zero in terms of our national interests. We have sold them billions of dollars worth of weaponry. We've provided them in previous billions of dollars worth of weaponry. We continue to provide them intelligence support. And we have sanctioned. The president has sanctioned the Russian Federation. He issued oil sanctions. All the oil sanctions everybody wanted him to do, he did them. He did them a month and a half ago. All I'm saying, now you point to all the stuff about, does Putin say this? Does Putin? That's why this issue set is difficult. I'm not claiming anything other than the fact that we understand it's difficult. We understand that you're not going to have a deal unless both sides have to give and both sides have to get. Both sides will have to make concessions if you're going to have a deal. You may not have a deal. We may not have a deal. It's unfortunate.
The U.S. should walk away from that if it
is
not a prime region interest because it's not in our continent.
That's not my decision to make. Ultimately, the president will make a determination if and when he feels like further U.S. engagement is no longer productive or serves the national interest. That's a decision the president have to make.
Is it the policy of the United States to seek regime change in Havana? And should we see the developments that are going on right now with Venezuela, the U.S. policies, as part of an effort to bring down the communist government?
Yeah,
and if I may briefly,
yeah.
do you stand by your statement earlier this year that nobody has died from U.S. aid cuts?
On the second point, I'm very proud of the changes we've made in foreign aid. Just yesterday, the day before, we are, I think before the end of this year, going to enter into over 50 compacts, health compacts with different countries around the world. Understand the way this used to work. We used to go to a country and say, we're going to give you a bunch of money for your health care programs. And then we would go out and hire some NGO in Northern Virginia or whatever. They would take their 60% cut off the top for administrative aid. They would take another 20%. Before you knew it, just a portion of that money was even reaching these countries. In many cases, many of those countries, it is true. I heard somebody whisper that's not true. It is true. In many of these countries, the governments didn't even know how much money was being spent. We are now entering into government-to-government compacts with these governments. And the compacts are the following. Not only are they provided assistance, but they are being provided a plan to build up their own self-sustainment and their own abilities internally. So that in the long term, these countries need less aid because they can now do it for themselves. Some countries may take 5 years, some countries may take longer, but we're very proud of that, and the countries are very excited about that. I'm also very excited about humanitarian aid. It's interesting. Nobody, you guys didn't pay a lot of attention to this, but this happened. In Jamaica, got hit by this hurricane. And everybody, I saw some articles, oh, this is going to be a disaster. The U.S. humanitarian response is not going to be good. It was excellent. Perhaps one of the best humanitarian responses in recent memory in terms of what we were able to bring very quickly to bear in assistance to them, led by our embassy, but also led by the region. And by the way, it was also very helpful that we had a lot of military assets in the region that were able to assist in that as well. We recently had an event in Sri Lanka. Again, we were able to very quickly provide assistance, the assistance they needed. So we're it's still a work in progress. We're still building this out. But I think in the big picture and in the long term, when people look back at this, they're going to say that we redid foreign aid in a way that actually delivered aid more effectively and in a way that furthered our national interests, both. And a lot of it driven from the embassy level. The amount of control and power and influence that our ambassadors and our embassies will now have to help shape how foreign aid looks like in those individual countries is much greater today than it was when you had USAID sitting alongside them almost as an independent branch that oftentimes took actions completely divorced, completely separated from our broader foreign policy.